It was supposed to be another polished morning interview, carefully timed, tightly produced, and completely under control. The lights were warm, the smiles were rehearsed, and the tone was meant to be calm. But within minutes, something shifted. A single question landed differently. The energy changed. And before anyone watching could fully process what was happening, one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces was no longer playing along. What unfolded on that live broadcast wasn't loud, chaotic, or explosive in the way headlines might suggest. It was quieter than that, more subtle, but somehow even more uncomfortable. Because this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a moment where control slipped, where timing broke down, and where live television did what it does best: reveal what can't be edited out. Before we go further, make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because moments like this remind us just how unpredictable live TV can really be. At the center of it all was Brad Pitt, a figure whose public image has been shaped over decades. Known for his composed demeanor and calculated appearances, he rarely allows interviews to drift off script. Every answer is usually measured, every expression controlled. That's part of what makes him one of the most enduring names in Hollywood. He doesn't just act in films, he understands the performance of public life. Across from him sat George Stephanopoulos, a journalist with a very different kind of reputation. Known for his calm persistence, his interviews often walk a fine line between conversational and probing. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't rush. But he asks the questions that matter, and more importantly, he knows exactly when to ask them. The setting was Good Morning America, one of the most watched morning programs in the United States. A show built on balance, light entertainment, serious news, celebrity interviews, all woven together into a seamless broadcast designed to start the day on a controlled, predictable note. But live television has one rule that no amount of preparation can override: anything can happen. And on that particular morning, it did. At first, everything followed the expected rhythm. The introduction was smooth. The tone was friendly. The conversation began in familiar territory: projects, career highlights, the kind of topics that allow both host and guest to settle into the segment. There was no sign, at least not immediately, that anything unusual was about to unfold. But live interviews are rarely just about what's being said. They are about timing, about pauses, about the subtle shifts in tone that signal something deeper beneath the surface. And as the conversation moved forward, those subtle shifts began to appear. It started with a question that didn't seem particularly unusual on its own. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but it touched on something that clearly wasn't as settled as it might have appeared from the outside. And in that moment, the carefully maintained balance of the interview began to tilt. Brad Pitt's response wasn't immediate. There was a pause. A small one, but noticeable. The kind of pause that feels longer on live television than it actually is. His expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough for attentive viewers to sense that something had changed. George Stephanopoulos didn't interrupt. He didn't push right away. He simply waited, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to make the moment real. This is where live interviews become something else entirely, not just a conversation, but a test of composure. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the situation might settle itself. That the answer would come, the tone would reset, and the interview would continue as planned. But that's not what happened. Because once a line is crossed, once a question lands differently than expected, it's almost impossible to return to the original script. What made this moment particularly striking wasn't just the question itself, but the timing of it. It came at a point in the interview where the audience had already relaxed, where the expectation was that the segment would continue smoothly to its conclusion. That's what made the shift so noticeable. There was no warning, no build-up that viewers could clearly identify in real time. Just a gradual tightening of the atmosphere. A sense that something unscripted was beginning to take shape. And in live television, that's where everything becomes unpredictable. Behind the cameras, producers are always watching for these moments, monitoring tone, timing, pacing, ready to adjust if necessary. But adjustments take time, and live broadcasts don't always give you that time. Decisions have to be made instantly, often without complete information. In front of the cameras, however, there are no such safety nets. Only the host, the guest, and the unfolding moment. As the conversation continued, the tension didn't disappear. It lingered. Subtle, but present. Each response carried a little more weight. Each pause felt a little more significant. And the audience, whether they realized it consciously or not, began to feel it too. This wasn't the kind of confrontation that erupts into shouting or visible conflict. It was something quieter, a shift in control, a moment where the expected rhythm of the interview broke down just enough to reveal something real. And that's what made it compelling. Because when someone like Brad Pitt, someone so experienced in navigating public appearances, begins to lose that sense of control, even slightly, it stands out. Not because it's dramatic in the traditional sense, but because it's rare. George Stephanopoulos, for his part, remained composed. That's part of his role. To hold the space. To keep the conversation moving, even when it becomes uncomfortable. But even within that composure, there are choices. When to pause, when to follow up, when to let a moment breathe. And in this case, those choices would define what happened next. What began as a routine morning interview was no longer routine. The tone had shifted. The balance had changed. And the next question, whatever it would be, was now carrying far more weight than anything that had come before. Because once tension enters a live broadcast, it doesn't just disappear. It builds. Quietly. Gradually. Until something has to give. And in this moment, with millions watching, with no edits, no second takes, and no way to rewind, everyone in that studio could feel it. Something was about to happen. And when it did, it would turn a standard interview into a moment that people would keep talking about long after the cameras stopped rolling. Long before that morning's broadcast, both men had built reputations that made a moment like this possible, if not inevitable. Brad Pitt had spent decades mastering not just his craft on screen, but the balance of public visibility. He was selective, careful, and rarely overexposed. His interviews were controlled, focused on projects, measured in tone, and designed to avoid unnecessary risk. That discipline helped him maintain one of the most stable public images in Hollywood. But public life shifts when personal narratives begin to overlap with professional appearances. In the period leading up to the interview, there was increased attention surrounding him, not tied to a single headline, but to an ongoing media narrative that had slowly built over time. Personal matters and public scrutiny created an environment where even routine interviews carried added weight. For someone like Brad Pitt, that changes everything. Because the conversation is no longer just about a film. Every question has the potential to pivot. Every pause can be interpreted. Every answer can carry meaning beyond what's actually said. Across from him was George Stephanopoulos, a journalist known for calm, precise interviewing. His background in political reporting shaped his approach, measured, patient, but capable of steering a conversation into more serious territory at exactly the right moment. That balance defines interviews on Good Morning America. Morning television is designed to feel easy and conversational, but it also carries an expectation of relevance. Viewers don't just want promotion, they want authenticity. And that creates a quiet tension beneath many live interviews. Leading up to this segment, everything appeared routine. Promotional schedules were in place, and the appearance fit naturally into that cycle. But behind the scenes, interviews like these are carefully structured. Producers plan direction, tone, and flow, while leaving room for flexibility. And that flexibility is where unpredictability lies. Because while celebrities may expect certain topics, the host has a responsibility to the audience. Ignoring widely known issues can feel incomplete. Addressing them directly can shift the tone instantly. Brad Pitt's public image at the time sat in that exact space, respected, but under closer scrutiny than usual. That meant one unspoken question lingered. Would it be addressed? Sometimes these topics are handled gently, sometimes avoided. But even avoidance creates tension, because everyone in the room knows what isn't being said. And that awareness changes the rhythm of the conversation. As the interview began, everything held steady. The tone was relaxed. The pacing felt natural. But subtle shifts started to appear, small pauses, slight changes in delivery. Nothing obvious, but enough to suggest the balance wasn't as stable as it seemed. George Stephanopoulos would have recognized that moment, the point where a conversation approaches a boundary. Choosing when to cross that boundary is what defines a live interview. Too soon, and it feels forced. Too late, and the opportunity is lost. But at the right moment, it changes everything. As the segment progressed, that moment drew closer. The audience was engaged. The conversation had settled. And now, there was space for something deeper, something unscripted. Because once a question moves beyond promotion, the interview becomes something else entirely. And when that question finally came, it wouldn't just continue the conversation. It would redefine it. The shift, when it came, was almost imperceptible at first. The conversation had been moving at a steady, familiar pace. Questions about work, reflections on craft, brief moments of lightness, everything aligned with the structure viewers had come to expect from Good Morning America. Both men were composed. The timing was precise. Nothing felt out of place. Then the tone changed. George Stephanopoulos didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He simply transitioned, subtly, almost seamlessly, into a question that carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't framed as confrontation. It wasn't aggressive. But it moved beyond promotion, beyond surface-level conversation, and into territory that had been lingering just beneath everything that came before. There was a brief pause. Brad Pitt didn't respond immediately. His posture remained composed, but his expression shifted, slightly, but noticeably. It was the kind of change that might go unnoticed in a recorded interview, something that could be edited around. But this was live. Every second held. The silence lasted just long enough to register. When he did respond, his answer was controlled, measured, but it lacked the fluid rhythm that had defined his earlier responses. The words were careful, as if being selected in real time rather than delivered from a familiar narrative. His tone remained even, but there was a restraint that hadn't been there before. George Stephanopoulos listened without interruption. That, in itself, extended the moment. There was no immediate follow-up, no shift back to safer ground. Just space, enough for the weight of the question, and the answer, to settle in. For viewers, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The energy of the interview had shifted from conversation to tension. Not overt conflict, but something quieter, more controlled, and because of that, more revealing. The next question came carefully. Not a direct escalation, but not a retreat either. It stayed within the same space, circling the topic without fully stepping away from it. A continuation, rather than a pivot. Again, Brad Pitt paused. This time, the pause felt longer. His body language remained composed, shoulders steady, gaze forward, but there was a slight tightening in his expression. The kind of micro-expression that suggests calculation, consideration, the awareness that every word, every reaction, is being watched in real time. When he spoke again, the response was shorter, more contained. The rhythm of the interview had changed completely now. What had once been a smooth exchange was now defined by pauses, by careful phrasing, by an unspoken awareness that the conversation was no longer following its original path. In the studio, the atmosphere shifted with it. Live broadcasts operate on timing, segments planned down to the second. But moments like this disrupt that structure. Producers, watching from off-camera, would have recognized the change immediately. Decisions would be forming in real time, whether to continue, to redirect, or to move on. But on camera, there was no visible intervention. Only the host and the guest, continuing the exchange. George Stephanopoulos maintained his composure. His tone remained steady, his delivery unchanged. But the nature of his questions had clearly moved beyond the initial scope of the segment. He wasn't pressing aggressively, but he wasn't stepping away either. That balance is what made the moment hold. Because it wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no interruptions, no visible conflict. But the tension was unmistakable. It lived in the pauses, in the slight delay before each response, in the way the conversation no longer flowed, but moved, carefully, deliberately, from one point to the next. At one point, there was a moment where it seemed the interview might reset. A brief shift in tone. A question that could have redirected the conversation back to safer territory. For a second, the rhythm almost returned. But it didn't fully hold. Because once tension enters a live exchange, it doesn't disappear easily. It lingers, shaping everything that follows. Brad Pitt's responses became increasingly concise. Still controlled, still professional, but noticeably different from the earlier part of the interview. The ease was gone. In its place was precision. George Stephanopoulos, recognizing the shift, adjusted, but only slightly. He didn't abandon the line of questioning entirely. Instead, he allowed the moment to breathe, creating space for the conversation to either resolve itself or reach a natural end. And that's when the defining moment arrived. It wasn't a single word or gesture. It was a combination of elements, a pause, a glance, a shift in posture, that signaled a decision. Brad Pitt leaned back slightly. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough to break the forward momentum of the conversation. His expression remained composed, but there was a finality in it, a sense that the exchange had reached its limit. There was a brief moment where neither man spoke. The silence, again, held. In live television, silence is one of the most powerful and uncomfortable elements. It draws attention. It magnifies everything. And in that moment, with millions watching, the silence said more than any words could. George Stephanopoulos began to speak, likely to transition, to regain control of the segment. But the rhythm had already shifted beyond recovery. Brad Pitt responded briefly, controlled, measured, but the tone made it clear that the dynamic had changed irreversibly. The openness of the earlier conversation was gone. What remained was professionalism, but with distance. The segment moved toward its conclusion, but not in the way it had been planned. There was no clear break, no visible signal to the audience that something had gone wrong. But the difference was unmistakable. The pacing was tighter, the responses shorter. The connection between host and guest no longer aligned in the same way. And because it was live, there was no opportunity to reshape it. No edits, no retakes, only the moment as it unfolded. For viewers, it may have lasted only a few minutes. But within those minutes, the tone of the entire interview had transformed. What began as a routine appearance had become something else, something more revealing, precisely because it remained controlled. Because not all confrontations are loud. Some are defined by what isn't said, by pauses instead of arguments, by restraint instead of reaction. And in that live broadcast, those elements came together in a way that couldn't be scripted. The cameras continued rolling. The segment ended. But the moment didn't. When the segment ended, the transition was immediate, but the atmosphere didn't reset as quickly. On screen, the broadcast moved forward the way live television always does. A shift in camera angle, a change in topic, a return to the structured rhythm that defines Good Morning America. To a casual viewer, it may have seemed like just another interview concluding on schedule. But in the studio, the energy had already changed. Moments like that don't simply disappear when the cameras cut away. They linger, in the silence between segments, in the quick exchanges behind the scenes, in the awareness that something unplanned has just unfolded in front of a national audience. George Stephanopoulos, to his credit, maintained the same composure he had shown throughout the interview. There was no visible reaction, no attempt to acknowledge the shift directly on air. That's part of the role. The responsibility isn't just to ask questions, but to hold the structure of the broadcast together, even when the moment threatens to pull it apart. And he did exactly that. But composure on camera doesn't erase what viewers experienced. Across social media and morning discussions, the reaction began almost immediately. Not explosive, not sensational, but observant. Viewers noticed the pauses, the shift in tone, the difference between the beginning of the interview and its closing moments. Clips began to circulate, not because of anything overtly dramatic, but because of how subtle the moment had been. The silence, the pacing, the way the conversation changed without ever fully breaking. That's often what gives live television moments their staying power. Because they don't rely on spectacle. They rely on authenticity. For Brad Pitt, the impact was more nuanced. There was no immediate statement, no public clarification tied directly to the interview itself. And in many ways, that aligned with the approach he had always taken, measured, controlled, and selective about when to respond. But perception doesn't require confirmation. The interview added another layer to an already evolving public narrative. Not because of what was said outright, but because of how it was said, and how it changed in real time. In the days that followed, media coverage reflected that complexity. There were no definitive conclusions, no single interpretation that dominated the conversation. Instead, there was analysis, observations about tone, timing, and the dynamics of live television. Some focused on the question itself, whether it was expected, whether it crossed an unspoken line. Others focused on the response, how Brad Pitt handled it, what his body language suggested, what the pauses revealed. But what stood out most was the moment itself. Because it wasn't scripted. It wasn't edited. It happened exactly as viewers saw it. And in an era where most public appearances are carefully managed, that kind of authenticity stands out. For George Stephanopoulos, the moment reinforced something that has defined his career, the ability to navigate complex conversations without losing composure. He didn't escalate the situation. He didn't retreat from it entirely. He held the space, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into something it wasn't. That balance is difficult to maintain, especially on live television. For Brad Pitt, the moment served as a reminder of how unpredictable live interviews can be, even for someone with decades of experience. Control, in that environment, is never absolute. It can shift in seconds, often in ways that aren't immediately visible but are deeply felt. And that's what made this moment resonate. Not because it was loud, not because it was confrontational in the traditional sense, but because it revealed the limits of control in a setting where everything is happening in real time. Years from now, viewers may not remember the exact words exchanged in that interview. They may not recall the specific question or the precise response, but they will remember the feeling of the moment, the shift, the pause, the sense that something real had briefly surfaced within a highly controlled environment. That's the power of live television. It captures what can't be rehearsed. It reveals what can't be edited. And occasionally, it creates moments that stay with audiences long after the broadcast ends. If you found this breakdown insightful, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes, the most important moments on television aren't the ones that are planned. They're the ones that happen when the plan no longer holds.